Good evening. Welcome to this 5th live cast, organized as part of a series of events leading up to the Media Architecture Biennale that will start exactly 2 months or 60 days from now. And this edition of the Biennale addresses the futures that are implied in urban media and design and features a range of disciplines from architecture and urban screens to interactive installations and location-based games. My name is Nanne Verhoef. I'm a professor at Utrecht University in the Department of Media and Culture Studies. And with my colleague Michiel de Lange and Tamalone van den Einde up in the booth, part of the research group Urban Interfaces. With Martijn de Waal and Frank Zurenbroek from Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences, Michiel and I are also part of the executive committee of the Biennale and host of this live cast on playful urban futuring.
Yeah, and with this live cast about playful urban futuring, we ask the question, how can we envision and experiment with playful future alternatives for urban life? So we're interested in the question how games and play can help us imagine possible alternatives for life in the future city. We have 5 speakers who are both researchers and practitioners, and they will share their thoughts with us. And if you're watching at home via Zoom, you can also ask questions in the chat. Now, let me briefly explain the order of the talks. We begin with some more concrete applications of urban games and then move on to the more abstract theme of urban futuring. So, without further ado, let's get started. And our first guest, she's not here physically with us. 2 of the guests are physically with us. And Astrid Magnus is speaking to us via Zoom. Warm welcome, Astrid. Great that you're here. Astrid is a PhD candidate at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at the Faculty of Geoscience in Utrecht. And she will talk about her mobile urban future game called Utrecht 2040, which enables its players to imagine solutions to complex sustainability problems and to reflect on them. Astrid, go ahead.
Thank you, Nanne and Michiel. Yeah, Michiel, you already introduced it wonderfully, because for this first presentation of this session, I wanted to talk about Utrecht 2040, a mobile urban sustainability game that I've developed with colleagues at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University and game studio IJsfontein, which is also a media architecture biennial partner. Next slide, please. And we started this urban sustainability game project from this notion that cities are on the front line, or they are the front line of the current environmental crisis. They're generally quite unsustainable places. But on the other hand, there are also these arenas where climate action takes place, where climate marches take place, where people experiment with clean energy and sustainable development. So they are really the center of this transition. But the transition to sustainability, of course, will really impact the daily lives of city dwellers. For example, if your energy system or your food system is completely changed, this will really change your daily lived experience. And we can see this in the Netherlands, for example, with the discussion around natural gas. There's a lot of policy and a lot of experimentation where people try to get neighborhoods to switch from natural gas to non-fossil fuels. But this is not going as planned for now, because it's just really difficult to make this transition from this large abstract problem to really change things on the ground in cities. And from this notion, we started the development of our game. Next slide, please. And games and sustainability are already quite an interesting combination. In the commercial sector, we see different examples of this. For example, Minecraft has been used by Greenpeace in the protection of a Polish primeval forest. But for example, Pokemon Go last week had a sustainability event around Earth Day. And a game like Animal Crossing I've included in this slide because I think it's a really interesting example of this place where people go to build a desirable or an ideal world that they can escape to. And in our game, Utrecht 2040, we wanted to use 2 particular strengths of games namely the experiential effect, where people can really experience different futures, and the experimental aspect, where people can experiment with the urban environment and try again, perhaps try different solutions. And we incorporated these two elements into our mobile game. We made it into an app that a lot of people can play at once in the city. And our main aim was for players to learn about sustainability problems, so give them new knowledge, make them reflect on their own position and role in this urban system, and motivate them for action after playing. Next slide, please. And to make it a bit more concrete, here are some stills from people playing the game. And generally, players download the app. We start usually in a big group, and then the players team up into teams, and they go out into the city. And in the game, there are a couple of nano lectures, we call them. So it's inspiring sustainability professionals like a restaurant owner or urbanists from Utrecht itself. And they ask the players a question that keeps them up at night, so to say. So, for example, the restaurant owner asks, why do people express this wish to eat more organic food, but then we don't really see that reflected in their actions? How can I solve this issue? And then the players go out into the city, they get different challenges. For example, solve it with coffee or stage an inclusive street performance. And they photograph this and they upload these photos to the map. And they get points for this. They can also like each other's photos, which also gains them points. So this is like a competitive element. And then in the end, the team with the higher score wins a prize. But perhaps the most important part is that at the end, all the players come together again and they reflect on this map that they made. So they reflect on this vision for a sustainable Utrecht in 2040 that they've developed together. And they discuss the different uploads and they discuss this whole picture that they've made together. Next slide, please. So yeah, again, here is a picture of a map that was generated by the players. And for us, it was really interesting that this digital environment also enabled us to measure whether this game had the effects that we intended. So we played it with more than 800 Utrecht University students, and we followed about half of them by surveying them before and after playing the game and holding a couple of focus groups. And of course, also analyzing their game uploads. So analyzing the types of everyday futures, the types of good practices that the players chose to put on the map. Next slide, please. And the results, we found that indeed it was quite effective in this way to look at the urban environment and get glimpses, so to say, into different urban futures. And the players reported that they really got new insights into sustainability problems. They got new ideas for solutions to these problems. Their attitude to the future became a bit more positive, but it was quite low generally, which is a bit concerning. And their motivations to act both individually and collectively, they reported that it also became higher. Next slide, please. Oh, there's one. Yeah. So yeah, what can we learn from this one intervention? I think it's a quite interesting example of how we can perhaps use games to bridge this divide between big abstract environmental problems and what it means for daily urban futures. And by experiencing different futures in a game or generating futures or a future image, we can see that it's motivating and it perhaps inspires action. And I think it's just really, really interesting that the technological possibilities are also developing so fast. So in both media and games, things just become more and more experiential. So it's a really interesting avenue, I think, to follow, to let people experiment and experience with different possibilities. I think it's also interesting that this commercial game sector is just so gigantic now that it would be interesting to tap into this potential of commercial games and really tie urban experimentation to games that people already play, like Animal Crossing, Pokemon Go, those types of things. And finally, for Utrecht 2040, I think a connection to local government and local policy making and local decision making is really interesting. Like, can we feed the results of this urban experimentation or playful urban futuring into more concrete processes? I think those are interesting things to think about, hopefully in this session as well. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Astrid. Well within time. Yeah, we have limited time for the speakers, of course, but what we'll do is we'll have every speaker first present and give their talk, and then all the way at the end we will hopefully still have a bit of time to take some questions and to have an interesting Q&A together with the speaker. So thanks again, Astrid. Please stick around for the Q&A all the way at the end. So now we can move on to the second speaker, and he's already standing here physically with us, so that's quite something nice to experience. Actually, somebody physically near us. It's Gabriele Ferri, who is a senior researcher at the Lectorate of Play and Civic Media at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. And there he is also the head of the master program Digital Design. And he will share with us how repurposed public payphones can be used to engage community members in visualizing speculative futures for their neighborhoods.
Thanks. It's really a pleasure to be here, also in person. It's so refreshing to step out of my Zoom bubble once in a while. As you said, my name is Gabriele. I work at the HVA, where I do way too many things. But tonight I'm here to talk about my new obsession with public phones, because, I mean, it's important to say that in my previous life, I've been a game criticist, a game designer. I've been working on a number of various projects, also in public spaces and so on and so forth. And recently, I've been a bit disappointed with some shortcomings of current technology. I mean, of course, it's important. The reason why we are here is that thinking about the future is important. Our future is reimagined all the time, and I think that this is something that is very important that we do as a society, as the previous speaker was saying. My first pain point is that not everybody gets to do that, because to take part in a participatory process, you need to have time to actually participate. To play with a nice mobile video game, you need to have a mobile phone, and again, the time and energy to do so. You need to speak the language. You need to have energy to spare. You need to be in all sort of interesting conditions that we should not take for granted. And yet, democracy requires collective imagination. If we, as a society, don't interrogate ourselves on what's next, then we are stuck. And again, if it is always the usual suspects, aka middle-aged white men, mostly highly educated, are the ones that end up participating for the most part, then we remain stuck in our present. And it shouldn't be like this. I really believe that play and participation are a really important tool in our toolbox, but we need to sharpen that a bit more. And my realization is that we should learn something from public telephones. So I will take this as a very quick object lesson. Of course, the idea of a phone booth is something that it's almost kind of a trope in a certain type of urban games. This is something that has been used in different types of playful speculation. I will just give a super quick overview. For example, this is a phone called Sankofa Red. It's been deployed around Los Angeles for the last, I think, almost 10 years. It is a hacked pay phone that has been used as a prop to engage a number of different actors in the community in creative back and forth. The question answering machine is kind of similar, but deployed in Athens. And again, people could interact with one another at a distance and ask open-ended questions about what they would like to see in a specific place. And the energy bubble is something that is a bit more smaller scale. It looks like an old school phone crossed with a blender, and it was meant to be a conversation piece to be given to people to bring home, and it was a bit of a Twitter stream and a bit of a talk radio, and occasionally it could prompt the user to answer specific questions. What do they have in common? Well, these are things that have really low barrier at the entry. Many of us know how to operate an analog phone. They are conversation starters. Usually, I mean, by definition, if you pick up a phone, you are about to speak to somebody else. Therefore, it's really easy to engage this kind of dialogue. And there is a really interesting narrative potential. I think that a mysterious phone that is ringing somewhere in a alley or in a square is one of the best in media res kind of starter for any sort of narrative. So we should learn from this in how do we make games for cities that make us think about the future. So what I'm going to do in the next 2 minutes is a speed run on lessons that we could learn from the humble payphone as a game designer. First of all, when designing a game for a specific place to prompt people to think about the future, maybe it is smart to use prompts and cues that actually exist in the physical space, aka a phone booth. Sometimes it could be nice to build narratives that start from those objects. So if I have a phone booth, that phone might at some point ring and I will be transported in some kind of future scenario. Of course, this is what games do. We should provide a good excuse to behave in a weird way. And again, we have all seen the Matrix series. We all know that a mysterious phone ringing without a good reason is always a good reason to behave erratically. It's important to give players something to chat about among themselves. So if we want to solicit dialogue, if we want to make people think, there is nothing better than just throw a conversation starter on the table and then, as a designer, gently fade in the background. People will just have a conversation among themselves, possibly on the phone. Which is my next point. I really believe, as a designer, that spontaneous conversations are absolutely important in this kind of activities. This is the core of what we should do as designers interested in this kind of application. And finally, it is also, if I put on my research hat, it is absolutely important to collect all the data that, all the rich data that players generate while chatting among themselves, while answering the various cues and prompts that we give them. And of course, we need to be very, very careful not to mess with their privacy because, of course, when I'm speaking on the phone, I don't usually assume that what I say is recorded. Like I said, this was a speed run. These were a bunch of design principles that I like to apply in my practice and in my teaching. And I think that as designers and as futurists, we should take public phones very seriously. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much, Gabriele, for this engaging talk. I really like how you speak about these public payphones as like everyday urban objects and how via sort of little alterations they can turn into these speculative objects to engage people in playful interaction and speak about potential futures. So that's really interesting, and hopefully we can, well, get back to that point also about how democracy requires a form of collective imagination. That really sort of triggered my thinking thinking. But for now, let's quickly move on to the third speaker, who is not with us physically, but with us via Zoom. He is Roc Crunch. Yeah, Roc is a very multifaceted person. He does all kinds of things. He's a researcher, a designer, a translator, and a radio journalist, engaged in projects like Futurescraft and the Peer-to-Peer Foundation and the Institute for Ecology in Ljubljana, Slovenia. And he will speak about participatory future games as wiki-commenting platforms. Go ahead, Roc.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, so I'll just go ahead with it. So it won't be news to many of you that today there exist radically different interpretations or imaginaries and stakes associated with alternative economic and political models and their institutionalization. The circular sharing economy, smart cities, collaborative governance, you name it. These are certainly buzzwords of the day, being taken up both by lay and expert, both self-proclaimed libertarians and communists, eco-modernists and degrowthers alike, but taking on different forms and normative claims. In short, these can be seen as discursive battles that are raging for the futures of this planet and its cities, and questions that drive me in the context of play here is, can game-based anticipatory processes as acting as civic platforms address or intervene into these discursive spaces or these discursive battles raging at urban, national, transnational levels in the alternative economy spaces that are emerging? And can such games really capture and thereby kind of augment these discourses and their interactions? And you could say render them thinkable and tinkerable. But can they perhaps also expose some false discursive binaries? For example, are the lines proposed between eco-modernism and degrowth really so clear-cut? So how does one import the kind of commenting, open source, collaborative design approach into societal futures inquiry and futures making is also a question I'm very passionate about here. And here, yeah, as the title, as Michiel said, wiki commenting is a kind of operative concept here. And thinking in terms of generative gaming, like how can you use games to co-generate transformative knowledge commons? So in our case, we can imagine various ideas, scenarios, seeds of change, if you will, and any number of other future building elements related to the tasks of unmaking capitalism and the construction of post-capitalist worlds. I'm interested in how games as platforms can facilitate these kind of co-generation activities. So in this phase, there's kind of been a discursive move on its own with notions like peer-producing futures and open source scenario planning and calls for global foresight commons, as in knowledge and design commons related to futures and the use of future processes. And another question that I'm very interested here, maybe at this point, we could share the kind of framework that I sent beforehand. Another question is theories of change used within a game. So how, in essence, games can use certain theories of change, of transformation, of transition as game mechanics, but also the question of theories of change of a game itself as, say, a boundary object or a boundary process. And in this context, say I'm interested especially in transitions theory, multi-level perspective, also critiques thereof, and how you can use games to reflect on these. While there's any number of other theories that kind of lend themselves, and even in their kind of vocabularies, very much lend themselves to gamification, say transformative social innovation theory, game changers, co-optation of social, socio-technical, socio-ecological innovation, Trojan horses in transitions, and so on. But as I said, it's kind of a discursive move also for the fact that there are no I suppose, mentionable or big examples of such practices out there currently. So the best I thought I could do is share some examples that I think approach this. These are kind of things that I've been working on personally and in collaboration with a few other collectives. And the first one being the Open Futures Library, which was designed by Jose Ramos and a few other people, kind of working in the kind of interstices of the commons and foresight and future spaces. And the idea is that it's a kind of online searchable collection of scenarios and other images of the future, and enables different kind of metadata, so kind of categorizations being developed by users themselves to enrich and the usability of this platform. But riffing on what I was saying earlier, I've had design discussions with Jose and a few others on how different game type interfaces could be introduced here. Or also interesting would be a kind of typology of environmental discourses of socio-technical imaginaries that are implicit in these scenarios that are being uploaded from all sorts of sources. And of course, offering building blocks for the co-creation of scenarios by users using game-based interfaces. And this brings me to a little bit of more concrete manifestation in terms of games, which is a personal passion project of mine, which I call Game Changers, the game. And in essence, it's a storytelling board game, but also game co-design springboard, created to engage player designers, specifically in conversations about the various discourses underlying emerging new economy claims, such as sharing, smart, circular, and collaborative. One can imagine, say, a monopoly board, but instead of different properties, you have different contested narratives and initiatives. And to advance and ultimately win the game, two teams embodying seemingly diametrically opposed poles, communism versus capitalism, or degrowth versus green growth, they have to compete in creating compelling sustainability transformation storylines in order to secure these fields, consisting of actual real world initiatives, mixes of global and also local. There's a big aspect of it is setting up the board with local narratives and local initiatives. And another example of a kind of platform that's very much in a ideation phase, but I think kind of gets the point across of the possibilities in this emerging space, is what I call Anticipedia and For Futures Festival. So I'd imagine this to be a kind of platform for co-generating and open sourcing, if you will, either elaborative future scenarios or scenario fragments or elements, which can be categorized or responding roughly to Jim Dator's generic four futures: growth, collapse, discipline, and transformation. And these would be creatively combined and enriched in specific situated contexts and enacted as this Four Futures Festival, as this kind of participatory LARP type festival, combining improvisational performance, speculative objects like future currencies or service designs in public space, that also invites the public to enter these spaces, these scenarios, to pre-experience these critical or utopian futures, and also help shape them. The lessons, ideas, new elements that are put up on the platform. So the platform enables this kind of virtuous cycle of co-creation of these elements, the building up of this kind of, or platformization, or giving a platform to a loud collective imagining of the possible as perhaps serving as some kind of potent counterpower to hegemonic discourses. So to conclude, playing with imaginaries has to become more explicit, I think, and subject of purposeful intervention design. And as designers, I think we can certainly do our part in making this happen. I believe games and game design can be potent boundary processes, and especially in this context of decades and centuries old debates and struggles reincarnated today, for example, in post-growth and urban commons movements.
All right, thanks very much, Rock. Yeah, I had hoped maybe you would have also included a couple of slides of these games you made, because I know that you did produce some images of these games. Were they included in your presentation?
Yeah, it's a kind of work in progress. I also have some plans on putting it up on Kickstarter.
All right. No, but I mean the images of the games themselves, but maybe we can share them later with the audience. Thanks very much, Rock, and hope you stick around for the Q&A afterwards. And let's now move on to somebody who is here physically with us, and that is namely our colleague, Dan Hassler-Forrest, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Media and Culture Studies, Utrecht University, and he is very much interested in cultural studies, critical theory, and science fiction. And Dan will show us how science fiction may indeed act as a tool for urban futuring.
Okay, thank you, Michiel. Yeah, I feel like a bit of an intruder, but thanks for having me. I mean, I'm not into. I don't really do design, and I don't do games. I mean, I don't do them because I suck at playing games, so they take me forever to do. So I watch movies instead and read some books now and then. And everything that I watch and everything that I read is all in some way science fiction. This has been the same my entire life. And I think I started out liking science fiction for just the obvious reasons, because they have cool spaceships and laser swords and stuff like that, weird planets. But as an alleged adult, I think the reasons that I continue engaging with science fiction are a little bit different, to a degree at least. That's what I tell my students. Because science fiction is the one genre that we have that is about imagining different futures, imagining how the world might be different. And that's what I'll talk about today a little bit. I'll try to keep it to 7 minutes, but I'm going to try. Okay, to talk about science fiction and the field of imagination, right? And I mean, like for me, I think like for a lot of people, it starts off with things like this, like the Starship Enterprise and the idea of like going out into the stars, boldly going where no man or later on no one has gone before, which is cool, right? But it's also a direct reflection of the cultural logic of industrial capitalism, right? It's the idea that we will expand infinitely in some kind of benevolent colonialism, which is really what the Federation does in Star Trek. So if we're thinking about sustainability, it's not really compatible, right? But if we're thinking about how science fiction and how the Enterprise is really just a city that flies around through space, we also understand that science fiction is always really also already about cities, right? And there's a fantastic book by futurist and urbanist Carl Abbott called Imagining Urban Futures. And the book starts in the introduction with a wonderful little syllogism. He says, science fiction is about the future, right? The human future will be urban. It is increasingly urban and it will continue to be so. And therefore, science fiction should be, and almost always is, about urban futures. But what kind of urban futures do we get in science fiction? If we think that science fiction is a genre about unlimited imagination, we always end up a little bit disappointed, at least when we look at science fiction as a mass cultural genre, which it is. We look at science fiction and we look at the iconic, canonical, future urban environments that we see so spectacularly on our giant cinema screens and home cinema systems, right? We basically get that same idea of bigger, faster, more, right? Expansive. Where does the food come from? We don't care. What kind of energy is driving all of these vehicles? Magical energy that comes from somewhere, someplace in the future. In a way, we might say that it's a reflection of something that futurist Marc Augé has defined as the real problem that we face politically, economically, and in terms of sustainability right now. He says the real problems with democratic life today stem from the fact that technology and technological innovations have increasingly been exploited and continue to be exploited by a system of financial capitalism that are always promoting what he calls an ideology of the present, or an ideology of the future now, like we're always already in the future, right? I mean, as a teenager, I used to think the future is going to be awesome, and now that I live in the future, and now I'm being told every day that this is the future and it's amazing, and look at what our smart watches and our smartphones and our smart shoes can do, right? it's not as utopian as Star Trek made it seem. It feels a little bit Black Mirror-ish to me, right? So what happens is it in fact paralyzes all thought about the future. Because what we get, I mean, the Jetsons were way ahead of this. If you look at science fiction in the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1960s, and we see these future worlds, right? What we're really seeing is we're just seeing a cleaner, faster, more technologized version of life as it already is. In fact, a very conservative vision of life. I mean, here are the Jetsons taking their kids to school, right? The teenager goes shopping, the mom gets dropped off to do the groceries, the dad goes to work, right? It's the traditional family unit, except they have flying cars, right? And now they have Teslas. So what happens, right, in this kind of field where we think we're getting something that is imaginative, but in fact we're just recycling old ideas with cool-looking designs? We start feeling a sense of despair, right? Despair is the state, and I love this phrase by Georges Monbiot, despair is the state we fall into when our imagination fails, when we have no stories that describe the present and guide the future. Then hope evaporates. And political failure, that's the failure that we're encountering every day now, is therefore in essence a failure of the imagination. And it's not just something that we see in politics, it's not just something that we see in public life, it's also something that we see in science fiction as a cultural genre. Increasingly, science fiction has moved from telling utopian stories about a great, wonderful post-capitalist future to dystopian, post-apocalyptic narratives of cute little robots wandering through this wasteland of a post-apocalyptic Earth that we have, destroyed through our endless consumerism. So what do we need to get out of this? Well, we need to go back to utopias, but utopias of the right kind, right? Not utopias about mastery, not utopias about endless expansion, right? Not utopias about white Europeans' dreams of conquering everything, knowing everything, and gaining access to infinite power and godlike abilities. That was the modernist dreams. We can't do that, right? And this wonderful book by Lisa Garforth called Green Utopias looks at science fiction as a kind of a resource for imagining wonderful utopian ideas that truly are dramatically different, and that can't be found in Spielberg movies, or in Star Wars, or even in Star Trek. Right? Because what they're basically feeding us is the same thing over and over. These kinds of utopias are utopias that stimulate critical and creative reflection on alternatives to the way that things are right now. They're critical interventions of the imagination that create a sense of alienation from where we are and encourage us to wonder how different things might be. And one form within science fiction is particularly adept at that. It's called Afrofuturism. Afrofuturism is like a subgenre of science fiction that reflects the experiences, the dreams, the suffering, the histories of the Black diaspora. And so Black people writing science fiction about what it has meant to be Black under industrial capitalism has thereby provided what H.L.T. Kwan has called an imaginary domain for radical democratic politics and life forms outside of white supremacy, outside of racial capitalism, and outside of heteropatriarchy. Now, you've probably heard of Afrofuturism because it went mainstream a couple of years ago with the cultural phenomenon of Black Panther. And Black Panther imagined a cityscape in Wakanda, a part of Africa that in the story world of Black Panther had never been colonized, in which we have a completely different engagement with what urban life might be. Not simply New York, but bigger, louder, and with flying cars, but a technologically advanced African environment that is diverse, that is very human, that is green, where rivers flow through it, and where we have a much more direct connection to the natural world and the world around us, and where all visitors are welcome. It's incredible to have this kind of utopian thinking, and it's what drives Afrofuturism in every form. So I'll end by simply describing, I'm going to skip this slide, by simply describing and recommending a book. Right? A book, it's a novel. If you've never read a science fiction novel, maybe start with this one. It's called Escaping Exodus by Nikki Drayden. And it's a wonderful, it's a crazy book because it's about a future in which humanity is no longer able to exist on Earth, and they've migrated off of Earth. And where do they live now? They live in space cities. But these space cities aren't like normal cities. In fact, they're like space whales. They're living beings. And what they're learning in this story is the relationship between themselves and their environment has to change in order for it to become sustainable. They have to learn to understand that the living beings that they inhabit are not just simply resources for them to exploit, but that they are symbionts. They have to work together in a form of productive symbiosis that really affects the way we understand our relationship, our imaginative relationship to our own environment and the cities that we inhabit. And I think thereby it provides a kind of playful way, a kind of thought experiment to engage with what cities can be, how we imagine ourselves within them, and how we, well, can use science fiction as a tool for that kind of futuring. That's it. I think that was 7 minutes. Thank you very much.
Wow. What a ride.
Thanks very much, Dan. Great stuff, very interesting stuff. And also thanks a lot for the literature tip, which I'll sure check out the upcoming holidays. So stick around with us. Hopefully we can take some Q&As or have some further discussions with you later on. But now, last but certainly not least, is Iris van der Tuin, who is a professor of theory and cultural inquiry and the director of the School of Liberal Arts at Utrecht University, and also the initiator of the Creative Humanities Academy. And in her talk, she will address how we can move beyond mere simplistic techno-fixes by mobilizing concepts and architectures for urban futuring. Go ahead, Iris.
Thank you, Michiel. So indeed, how to imagine urban futures playfully. And specifically, I want to ask, how do we move beyond techno-fix when being involved in futuring? Well, let's first define techno-fixing in theory by conceptual thinking and in practice as a design principle. The verb to fix has two meanings. One refers to offering solutions to problems and the other to fixating in the sense of adjusting, making rigid or immobile. The contemporary American feminist theorist and scholar of science and technology, Donna Haraway, is critical of techno-fixing as the unsituated development of technologies, very expensive technologies, that are then implemented from afar, inserted into communities of humans and non-humans, which leads to disruptions, not solutions. Haraway proposes to work with a sense of care for the community, its multi-species and socio-material environment, and for technology itself. How can such careful science, technology, and design projects take off? It implies working imaginatively and from the bottom up, not distantly and from the top down. Let us go back to a shared past in order to find such an approach and a common future. The American philosopher Suzanne K. Langer, born in 1895 in New York City in a German immigrant family, had wide-ranging interests and a seeming disrespect for philosophical canonization. In philosophy, thinkers are often classified, fixated, according to schools of thought, and schools of thought are often seen as mutually exclusive. Langer borrowed from all kinds of philosophical traditions and came to some very imaginative thoughts in conversation with science, technology, and art. Let's read a bit of Langer, and here I would like my PowerPoint slide to pop up. Note, mobile architecture. The architecture of small boats is dictated by the seascape on which the boat is set. The Indian canoe slides like a fish. The Norse boat is obviously suggested by the swimming bird. The trireme is a human stronghold defying the waters. The various sloops and junks and other boats concentrating on the sail are drifters like leaves. But whatever the motive, the boat or ship is the place of man on the waters. Trains, cars, carriages for travel are all mobile housings. Their expression is of temporary adjustment and especially safety. A railroad car should not look like a parlor, but invite the packing away of luggage rather than its opening out, as hotels should, and the forward orientation of the traveler. So this was Suzanne Langer. Langer discusses mobile architecture on this index card from the 1950s or 1960s. Architecture, for Langer, is an art form that gives to the sense of movement, just like painting gives to the sense of sight, sculpture to the sense of touch, and music to the sense of hearing. The curious formulation of giving to the sense of is intentional. Langer wants to stay away from an idea of art forms resembling movement, sight, touch, hearing, etc. Art speaks to these senses, as it were, and activates them. Being one of the plastic arts, architecture addresses virtual space. Pictures and painting address space through scene, sculpture via kinetic volume, and architecture by expressing an ethnic domain. Ethnic here is not supposed to mean a place of in and exclusion of a people. Langer writes, architecture has its own center and periphery, not dividing one place from all others, but limiting from within whatever there is to be. Mobile architecture also implies a mobility in thinking architecture and is not simply limited to moving objects. Langer makes a distinction between motive and expression and prefers expression to motive. With motive, we multiply resemblances. Boats slide like fish, swim like birds, float like leaves. And with the logic of resemblance, we narrow down our possible frames of analysis. A resemblance is cultural. It is an overcoded interpretation that X resembles Y. Resemblances work with the distant top-down register of sight. Look, a boat that slides like a fish. Such a logic fixates how we can think about art forms, here architecture, and reduces how we may interpret individual works of art and our engagements with them. On this register, we do not discuss what the work itself may do and what it may intervene in imaginatively. Expression, however, allows for the study of precisely this performativity. All possible boats or ships are the place of people on waters, and all possible carriages are the place of people on roads. Both kinds of places express temporary adjustment and especially safety. And as such, they are meant to close in instead of open out. Unfixing the way in which we think about art forms, we are enabled to transcend the game of representation and its corollary truth-falsity discussions. We are enabled to be creative with artistic design and technological production. In the words of Suzanne Langer's friend and colleague, the German Jewish philosopher Ernst Cassirer, who had fled to the United States halfway through World War II and met Langer there, witnessed the problem of flight, which could only be solved once technological thinking freed itself from the model of bird flight and abandoned the principle of the moving wing. All possible planes are the place of people in the air. Langer's move from resemblance to expression can be understood as a move from representation to conceptualization. The representational register allows us to repeat what we think we know about boats and planes and fish and birds and leaves. We are invited to project these fixating and fixative knowledges onto one another and naturalize their apparent connection. The conceptual register, however, focuses on the invention or intervention of that what is in the same move identified. Flight for human travel came into being and could finally be experimented with once the restriction of the fixed model of bird flight was left behind. This expression and conceptualization is precisely how we can also stay mobile with architectures for urban futuring. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Iris, for this great talk and this very experimental sort of setup with just one slide, which is a handwritten analog archival card. Great stuff. Bear with us. We're going to have, maybe can I invite Gabriele and Dan back to the table, because we hope to be able to have a nice conversation involving both the people online, but also the two speakers who are physically with us present in the studio today. And maybe as just like a warming up question, perhaps for all of us, or maybe those of you who care to address it. I'm really interested in how basically all of you have been speaking about the way that games or any kind of, or indeed also science fiction can be used for critically reflecting on possible urban futures. So maybe can I invite maybe perhaps first Astrid and then move over to one of the physical speakers, maybe Dan, to chime in here and say a few more words about the critical potential of games for Astrid and science fiction for Dan. How do you see this?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really good question. I think in the way that Gabrielle also used the phones, I think games can be a conversation starter, and there can basically be whatever you want them to be. And I think with Utrecht 2040, we really tried to really stage everything around the game as well, to make it like to build in as much space for reflection as we could, to really shift the perspective at the end and really enable players to reflect critically on what they did and just on their own role as well in the urban system and on this new future that they made together. But I'm also really happy with what the other speakers brought to the session today, because I think, for example, a framework like Rocks is really interesting to reflect critically on a game like Utrecht 2040, which I think is also really important to do. Because we found that people are really attracted to this idea of games, and it tends to make people who use them a bit uncritical, perhaps. So reflecting on the practice of using games in an urban context is really important too.
Can I ask a tiny follow-up question? Because you spoke about Utrecht 2040, of course, your game. How much room was there for players to deviate or to engage in, let's say, deviant play that was not really supposed to happen, but that they did anyway?
Yeah, we try to make that space as large as possible. Of course, like, you're bound to this interface, but we made the assignments very open, and there were no restrictions on what people could upload to the game, what people could contribute to this collective vision. And afterwards, we got some questions from players like, "Oh, could you incorporate a route in this game? Like, send us to different places, maybe make the assignments a bit more specific." But we were really intentional in keeping it very open and really up to the imagination, and a bit confusing as well. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Same question to Dan, and then I want to give the word to Nana. Dan, so the critical potential, the potential for criticality in science fiction. For example, Afrofuturism that you showed.
Well, I mean, you know, the critical potential is always in context, right? So I think science fiction is one of those genres that exists in a very particular cultural sphere where we approach it as something that is purely entertainment. So anything that is set in the future, that has spaceships or aliens in it or something, you know, we watch it in the same way that we watch a soap opera or The Lord of the Rings. We just turn off our critical lens, and we watch it as something simply to enjoy. And things that we enjoy tend to be things that we recognize. We respond to things that we're very familiar with. So we respond to cliches and to usually conservative ideas. What we found, and I work quite a lot with the Urban Future Studio in Utrecht, where we do a lot of futuring activities, and I've done a lot with people who are in policy or in design or in government. If you put them in a context where they're asked to look at something that they knew and had always seen as entertainment, but to look at it from that perspective, right? To look at it through the lens of what does this say about the future of cities, or how does this, you know, either reproduce existing ideas or bring in new stuff to the table, then all of a sudden your perception changes. And so I think it's really a question not so much of whether or not science fiction as a genre has that potential, but about explaining and helping people see that those kinds of stories about the future, and that a critical lens, and us cultural studies are familiar with this, but not everybody's, you know, a cultural studies person, not everybody's used to looking at entertainment or culture or media that way. One huge step is strengthening media literacy and looking at sort of, okay, so how do politics, society, and culture constantly interact? And the second is taking these elements that exist within it and saying, well, you can actually productively apply that lens to them and see them as something else than merely entertainment.
Great, thanks. Yeah, something that really strikes me, and basically what all of you did was how also the movement in and back out of the game or the story, the temporary suspension of disbelief, but then stepping outside of that frame again, that is possibly the critical movement.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I think Astrid's game, the Utrecht 2040, is a really great example because people play that game in a very specific context and with a very specific goal. Not because somebody told them, "Ooh, there's a great new game going around, you should play it," but because it's part of this. You're approaching it within this idea of what do games teach us about sustainability. It's a student project. It's a very different kind of thing, right? And I think asking those questions. I mean, how do you make a game that is both fun to play and that does those things, or how do you tell a science fiction story that it both works as something that is fun and engaging as a science fiction story, but that also can help you develop that critical lens that I was just talking about. I mean, that's a thing that all designers and storytellers, I think, are struggling with, and that is part of our job as intermediary, maybe, to help unlock.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that earlier question about the criticality or the critical potential, and maybe explore the criticality as also an experiential category. We tend to think of the criticality very much in terms of, or in an intellectual and political sense, but games also offer the possibility for on-site, location-based experiences that some of you also address. And I have a question for Iris and for Gabriele. And if we have time for Rock, but we are close, running it close. So maybe what do you see as the role of serendipity and the informality of experiences in playful futuring?
Yeah.
And this is a question for both of you. Let's start with Gabriele and then to Iris.
I think it's really fundamental. I'm finding myself more and more passionate about the idea of prompting the people that I would normally not interact with in my daily life. And I think that those are the inputs that we really need to capture to make futures that are inclusive and that are different from the standard ones. And that means that as a designer, I need to be open to the fact that games bring chance encounters, bring actions that are unscripted by the designer, bring conversations that are outside of my control. And I think that is exactly the space of possibility that we should design for. Thanks.
Wow, thank you. Iris, do you have a response to that question? The role of serendipity.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the point that I tried to make by talking about Suzanne Langer's work is that she asks, so how do we leap out of what is going on or what is going wrong, or how do we leap out of what we know or what we think we know when we actually develop futures and games and also the fictioning examples that Dan discussed. I think they really leap us out of what is going on and what we think we know. So and why? Because it is in these game and fiction worlds, it is impossible to stick to one line of thinking or acting or doing. And I think in Astrid's talk, the idea or the experiential was connected to the experimental. And I think that's a very important connection that was made there, and that we try to explore in the Creative Humanities Academy that indeed I initiated together with Nana, with you.
I think it's time for us to leap out of this session in all the possible senses of that phrase. But first of all, before we end, I want to thank you as an audience and you speakers, all of you, and also want to thank the Utrecht focus area of playing games with their support, partially also for the organization of the MAB. So as we mentioned in the opening of this livecast, the Media Architecture Biennial is starting in 60 days, 2 months, and the event will host lots of workshops, presentations, and other events. So check out the program at mab20.org and join us there.